Voilà, vous connaissez peut-être cette vidéo.
You may have seen this video before. We wanted to start with this catastrophe, the destruction in 2012 of the Kodak factories that used to provide the silver prints material. We are going to talk about silver prints here. So this was the Shallow Sol factory, but there were all the Kodak factories have been destroyed.
Cela signifie que les photographes n'ont plus avoir beaucoup moins de surface sensible pour tirer leurs photographies. Alors on va commencer par une première question.
Okay, we'll begin with the first question.
Oui, oui, on peut se présenter.
Welcome to everyone.
All right. I'm the former director of the Élysée Museum in Lausanne. I'm also an exhibition curator, supposedly retired. I decided to stop photography at the end of my career. So I still have 50 years ahead of me. No, sorry, I contributed for 50 years to photography. I am fascinated. I'm not in the photography market, but I appreciate the quality of the printing. When I was invited by Florence to moderate this session, I accepted because I also have questions. I
am now going to give the floor to Jonas. Hi, my name is Jonas Tabib. I worked at several photography galleries and then moved to auction houses, which really can show us an overview. I am now a consultant, an advisor
to buy and sell photo collections. So we're really within the topic. So I was the pupil of Françoise in a photography class. I was very proud, a good teacher, says the quote, is someone who is progressively unuseful. Françoise Pavillot, gallery created by Alain Pavillot 50 years ago. So I have a gallery activity. I also like to teach, share, and I also curate a lot of exhibitions. So we all worked a lot. We got along fine. Something simple, accessible to reflect on. Well, first question, what is vintage? Just a little preamble. my children who are 20 years old. Vintage means clothes, out, outdated, but redated probably. So there is an aspect, a respect for the past. The connotations are positive. It indicates something with a value. So I will ask Françoise, who has 50 years experience with this word, to define more precisely this term. So, vintage, the word comes from the English term vendange. It was used to characterize photographs that were printed. So the importance of the printing there, that were printed close to the moment when the photographs were taken. The printing is an intention. It takes place at a precise moment. We will develop this over the time. We will provide you with numerous examples. So there is this notion of authenticity and past. Okay. It might not be valid today because we evolve with time, but we will now travel in the modern age, in the 20th century. Françoise, do we know who first used the term? Well, I made a survey in the United States. Okay, I will tell you an anecdote I never told anyone, very quickly because we do not have much time. In the 70s, recently, I made a survey, an inquiry, and people told me it's Ayrole, it's this one or that one. I think I have the solution through a friend. I won't tell you who, but it's a gallerist who one day told that friend of mine, well, I met this gallerist who told me, let's call these photographs printed at the time vintages. And I wondered how this guy could have found such an incredible and good idea. So it's a term, well, used for photography as from the 70s, 80s. It is true that, to come back on what you said, the notion of vintage is related to quality in time. I'm talking about clothes here. Besides the fact that you're in the spirit of the photographer when they take the photograph, it's also a quality of printing and what we're going to develop afterwards. So there is also the legal aspect. Such a photography, it's in the 5 years to describe a photograph that is printed just after it has been taken, to know when it has been printed. Sometimes you don't have any. So sometimes it's a bit enlarged to other terms that are going to be used afterwards. Normally it's that. So when it's called of the time, it's called 5 years after the photograph was taken.
The second question is that related with the 19th century? What you can see here is daguerreotype. I remember back in the day somebody telling me this is just a reference to my colleague Jean-Luc Tartarin with a beautiful booth. There are beautiful, very beautiful daguerreotypes on his booth. They are unique works. Do go and have a look. There are no copies available anywhere. Yes, and this is related to the end of a daguerreotypy. Because if we think about paper photography, the competition of paper photography, yes, because photography was invented back in the days in the 19th century where we were looking to industrialization, this multiplicity. And instead of having multiplicity, we end up with one unique piece of works. So a failure in a way. But if you look at these daguerreotypes, you will find exceptional quality. Of course, we're not going to go through the full history of photography right now. We would not have time, unfortunately, but we are going to turn directly to camera rolls. You can see here Negre, the middle of the 19th century, really, when Fox Talbot invented really this notion of photo negative, of negative film. And then we can have multiples of these images. So you can see the positive and the negative film. Here are the differences. You can see, yes, we can have several prints. We can have several positives out of these negatives. Absolutely. You can see here the first shooting studios. This is Fox Talbot in about 1940, 1840, sorry, 1850. So here you can see assistants. We're outdoors. We don't have access to power, electricity yet. Electricity already is available, but just not linked available everywhere. And so it's the daylight is used for photography, and you can see small prints exposed to sunlight, which will reveal the image. So we have to, of course, mention that up to the digital age, photography, the principles around photography rely fully on the silver salts and their reaction to light, right? Absolutely. Yes, let's directly look into this setup. You can see very craftsman setup. You can see a contemporary device here. You all know it, I believe. And we know that this is how we're going to start working with expansion. And so we can stretch the photos, work in the dark room. And so this is where the photographies then can be printed through different applications. So this is what this device looks like in detail. The idea is we apply this film and we've got the enlarger head, and we can enlarge to a different size. And so that's when we can print in larger format. And so we move on from the negative with the positive being always the same size to now prints in different sizes and formats. So this is the start of photography, really, I would say, very similar to contemporary photography, where we love to now print in even larger sizes, but it's really depending on the machines. We have the enlarger, and of course, the whole industry around photography has also changed and evolved. So I quote Sudek here, saying that negative would be like a music sheet. Well, you would have a director really has to be able to read this music sheet, and this all happens in the dark room. It's about this interpretation of the negative, which will express colors differently depending on light level. I'm sure all of you in the room are very much used to this development, printing in dark rooms.
vous
So
avez
you
ici
know
des
that it
formats
will
portés.
depend
Si à la fin, si
on
quelqu'un veut les regarder,
the light, of course,
vous
but
ouvriez
also
à
the
l'épaule. C'est
paper.
pour
Here
ça
in
qu'on
this
vous a
booklet
présenté tout
I
à l'heure la
brought,
destruction des usines Kodak.
we showed you the
Ici, vous
Kodak
avez, des
factories,
quantités
the way they were
énormes
destroyed,
et
and the
magnifiques de
catastrophe
papier
that it
absolument
is,
superbes.
because
Je
they
me rappelle
had
très
such
bien d'un
wonderful
photographe qui est
types of
bien connu
papers for
peut-être, qui
silver
s'appelait
prints.
René Jacques,
I remember
qui me
René
disait toujours,
Jacques,
cette
wonderful
photo-là,
photographer, who used to
je
tell
l'ai
me,
tirée
you
sur du
see this
papier
photo,
velours. Il
I
avait du
printed
papier
it
velours.
on
Donc le
velvet
choix du papier,
paper. There
c'était
was
aussi,
a
et c'était,
velvet paper. This
ça donnait
choice of
aussi
the
sa
material of the
matérialité
paper
à la
would give
photographie.
the materiality that the photographer
Juste
is looking
une
for
observation
to
sur cette question
this
de
image.
cette idée de la
Yes, just
musique.
related to
Il y
this
a des
music
années,
sheet
décennies, j'ai
idea.
vu une exposition à New
Decades
York des
ago, I saw an
autorités
exhibition in New York
photographes
where they
de
invited
faire
30
leur travail
photographers
à partir de mêmes négatifs.
to present
Juste
their
pour montrer
prints
exactement ça,
based on the
la gamme de
same
possibilités. Il y
negative
a cette infiniment en
film.
fait. Mais le public pense que
There are infinite
le négatif va
possibilities
donner toujours le même
because
résultat. Et
people
c'est pas
may
le cas.
think that using the same
Oui, oui,
negative,
c'est pour ça,
we
je
will
suis peut-être
have the
revenu sur le
same
titre de cette petite
result,
intervention
but
qui
it's not
s'appelle
true.
La
Yes,
photographie aux
the
multiples
title,
rares.
of
Donc
course,
quand
of this
on
conversation is
s'intéresse un petit peu
photography
près
a rare
la
multiple.
photographie, c'est une
Because
expression
if we look
d'Alain
closer,
Paviot, hein, et
it's
on
an Alain
s'aperçoit qu'en fait, le
Pavillon
tirage, il y a autant
expression
de possibilités. D'abord, à
and
l'époque, on
phrase,
ne tirait
because
pas
we know that
énormément,
it,
hein, on
back in
faisait
the
pas
days we didn't
beaucoup de
print
tirages, et
so
en
many
plus, chacun
times,
avait sa personnalité, il y avait cette fameuse
and every
intention.
print
Ici,
has
là, je
their
vois pas
own
s'il y a des collectionneurs,
personality
il y a aux
and their
États-Unis,
own
je crois que c'est
intent.
Paul
In
Messier
the US, I think it is
qui fait
Paul
des collections,
Messier who
qui de
presented
toutes les
this
banques
collection.
de
He
papier
collected all the different
photographique.
types of paper
Alors,
available for
dans la chambre
photography.
noire, il va se
In
passer
the
aussi
dark
quelque
room,
chose de très important parce
what
qu'on va
happens?
travailler avec des papiers, on
Of
va
course, we are
régler
working
les
with a
lumières,
certain type of
régler les
paper. We need
éclairages,
to set the
mais
level of
qu'est-ce qu'on va faire
light.
aussi? On va
We need lighting,
recadrer.
and we also
Voilà. Alors,
reframe.
ici, une petite anecdote,
And
enfin
just
quelque
a
chose assez
short
important pour moi.
story I would
Voilà
like
une
to
photographie de
share
Man Ray.
here. We see
Man Ray
a
a fait cette
photography
première
by
photo,
Man Ray.
et c'est une photo
So
qui a
Man
été
Ray shot
solarisée. Vous voyez,
this photography, and it
c'est un
is
phénomène
a
qui se passe au moment du
solarized
tirage,
photography.
au
This
moment
happens
soit du développement
during
du négatif ou du
during
tirage. Donc c'est
printing,
une très belle
printing or
photo. Mais
negative
cette photo a été,
reveal. And
ça n'est pas la photo que voulait Man Ray.
this is not actually exactly the photo,
Voilà la photo de
the
Man Ray.
picture Man Ray
Man Ray a fait cette première photo
wanted.
et il a dit, moi,
Man Ray
enfin,
took
c'est vrai, on
this
pourrait presque dire qu'il est un petit peu
photograph,
pas banal.
and we could say it
Et
looks a
il
little
a
bit
cherché ce qu'il voulait
trivial,
rendre exactement
perhaps.
dans la photo de ce corps. C'est
Common,
ça,
what he
voilà.
wanted to reveal in
Et
this picture of the
toujours,
body is
il y a
this
c'était à chez
section, this
Swan, une
cropped
maison de vente de
section.
New
So
York.
at
Un jour est passée cette
Swan
photographie
in New York,
et
one
mon
day
cher
this
mari Alain
photograph was
Pavio
exposed,
a
and
tout de
my
suite
husband,
téléphoné chez
Alain
Swan en disant,
Pavio,
écoutez, vous ne pouvez
called
pas vendre, mettre en vente cette photographie
chez Swan
parce que Man
immediately,
Ray n'a jamais
said,
voulu
"You
ce
cannot
tirage. C'est un tirage
exhibit
qui a
this
été fait
photography. Man Ray never
ailleurs, qui a
wanted
été fait par
this
quelqu'un d'autre,
photograph to
mais
be
qui n'est pas le bon
displayed
tirage,
like
c'est
this.
pas
It is
son
not the
tirage.
right
Ce
print.
qu'il
It is
faut,
not
c'est ça.
representing the
Voilà.
intent of
Et
the
la
photographer.
photographie, on
This
s'est
shows
aperçu,
the intent of the
aperçu que Alain avait
photographer."
raison
And we
et on a
realized
retiré
Alain
la
was
photographie de la
absolutely
vente.
right, and so
Alors,
we
cette
removed
photographie précédente, elle
this
est
photograph
intéressante parce
from
qu'elle
this
montre justement comment un photographe va
exhibition. It's, I
choisir,
think, an
va donner
illustration, a
corps à
perfect
son
example of
négatif,
how the
mais ça
photograph will
reste
then reveal
documentaire.
Qu'est-ce
their
qui s'est passé
photography
avec cette
according
photographie?
to
Et
their
cette photographie
intent.
a
And
été
what
retirée de la
happened
vente. On
where this
sait,
photograph was
on va pas encore
removed,
caler
was
parce que
withdrawn from
plein de
that
petites histoires de tirage,
sale?
etc.
Of
Mais
course,
elle a
there
été
are
retirée de la
always
vente. Alors c'est
this
vrai que vous
type of
pouvez l'avoir chez
anecdotes
vous, la mettre
exists,
sur
and
votre mur,
of course,
pourquoi
you
pas.
could
Mais
use this
comme je
image,
dis, vous
display it
pouvez
on
avoir ce
your
que vous
wall at
voulez, mais
home. Why
sachez
not?
ce que vous
You
avez.
could,
Voilà.
you should, but you should know whether this was the intent behind this photography or not.
Donc, et voilà un autre exemple de
And
recadrage.
another
Vous
example
voyez
of how
ici
an
à
image can
droite,
be
vous avez la
framed,
photographie originale.
reframed, or
Donc le
cropped.
vintage,
You can see
ce
on
qu'on
the
va voir
right-hand
ici, le
side the
vintage, c'est pas
original
forcément
photograph, and we
le
wanted to
négatif original.
tell you
La
here
photo
that
telle qu'elle a été prise au
vintage doesn't
départ.
necessarily mean
Voilà la
exactly the
photo
picture
telle
that
qu'elle a
was
été
shot
prise
at
par
the
toujours Man
start.
Ray.
First
Et
picture
voici
taken by Man
le
Ray
tirage, le
again, and you can
recadrage.
see
Vous
on the
voyez ce qui
left-hand
se passe
side,
si vous
once
regardez
it
bien.
is
Il y a un
actually
petit effet
cropped,
d'optique
you
et
see
ces
this
deux bouches,
beautiful
je dirais,
optical
enfin je ne vais pas dire ça, mais enfin quand
illusion,
même,
we could say, the
les deux
two
portraits sont
mouths mouth Because the two portraits, you could say it is a little bit trivial, common perhaps, but on the left-hand side, it is a much more powerful image because the mouth, the nose with the dark space in between, a flower appears. This was the intent Man Ray wanted to display, to reveal. Yes, this right-hand side photography is actually currently exhibited, and it is actually very interesting to see all the different crops Man Ray tried out of this photography. So it is exhibited with a doll next to it. And so we have to note that, yes, Man Ray attempted to actually produce on the left-hand side, he's created different versions with colors, etc. It's become an object and many derivative versions. Yes, we wanted to actually insist on and highlight this photographer's intent. Some photographers like to print, and I would like to mention Pierre Gassman, he created the picto laboratories. He used to tell me, I know the photographer, I know what they are looking for, and I know how to print this for them, because they were close, they were friends with the photographer, between the photographer and the printer. Yes, and we have to think about photographers, of course, they have a specific idea of what they would like to reveal, but the printer also will adjust the levels of colors, the right paper. And so, of course, this printer will have also a specific idea about how to reveal. They have a level of sensitivity, I suppose. Some will just print as is, and or it can take weeks to adjust exactly the right colors. I know that some will take this craft, this trade differently. Yes, I wanted to ask a question. If we are still talking about vintage photography, and so taking a picture in 1922, for example, or 5 years later, printing the same photography, would there be a different value attached to it for a collector? Of course, there is that value scale we have to mention. It's not always actually identical. I mentioned the Z model and Diana Arbus photography is more famous, but Lisette Model, when she passed away, we found out she had a lot of prints from the 40s, small formats, because she didn't really have a lot of money. She did several small prints, dense prints, because that was her style. And 40 years down the line, in the 70s, a portfolio was created for her prints in larger size to promote her work. And these prints are beautiful. But we know that she preferred to exhibit the earlier prints. And we know that institutions now prefer to actually find the original prints we found under her bed decades ago compared to the prints from the 70s, looking a bit more flat. Yes, I would react to what you shared here, Jonas. I was going to mention that later on, but you gave me a transition. We saw with Henri Cartier-Bresson, just a short story. We had an exhibition at our gallery on Henri Cartier-Bresson's work. He was already fairly old. It was 2 years before he passed away. He came with his cane. I thought, oh, when he came in the gallery, I thought he's going to tell me off. But he told me, Madame, why are you exhibiting these old prints when now there are such amazing, very good prints available from laboratories? And so I am sharing the story, which is actually written here by Brigitte Ollier, this short book called titled Henry. I said, well, I worked at Centre Georges Pompidou, and at Georges Pompidou, we bought the chair, la chaise by Le Corbusier, a print from the 30s. We have to say actually this chair, actually
La
this
toile de jute qui est en dessous,
leather
c'est
is
tout neuf,
aging.
mais c'est l'objet tel que
The fabric
Henri
underneath
Cartier-Bresson,
is actually coming
tel
apart.
que merci,
The
merci,
jute.
tel que Le Corbusier le voulait.
And so
Maintenant,
we
vous
know
avez
that we
chez,
can no
je
longer
crois que c'est
present
chez
this chair by
Cassina,
Le Corbusier
vous avez
the way
le
that he
même
wanted.
fauteuil.
At Cassina,
Le dessin est toujours aussi beau,
the
c'est le
armchair,
dessin de
you can
Corbusier.
see
Mais
the
d'ailleurs,
drawing.
ce qu'on a acheté au Centre
The
Pompidou à
drawing by
l'époque,
Le
je crois que c'était
Corbusier
dans
is
les
still as
60 000 ou
beautiful.
80 000
We
euros.
bought, I think,
Maintenant,
this
chez Cassina, c'est 10
work
000 euros.
60,000 or
Et il est tout
70,000
neuf, il est
euros.
magnifique,
Now at Le
mais
Cassina,
ça
it
n'est
costs
plus le même
10,000
objet.
euros.
Donc,
It is
c'est
a
pas
new
une
version
question
of this
d'acheter
object,
ce
but it is
que
not
vous
the
voulez,
same
mais
object.
sachez ce
So
que
this is
vous
very much related
sachez
to
ce
buying
que vous
vintage
voulez.
objects. You can choose to buy
Alors,
one
on
or
va
the
revenir
other.
au
It is up
tirage
to
au...
you,
Alors,
but I think you should be
justement, pour
fully
vous
informed.
expliquer, ben, on peut...
That's
Ça, parce que
what
ça, c'est
matters.
Jonas ou
And
le tirage original, le tirage
the
moderne,
original
le tirage
print,
postérieur.
modern print, or what we call posterior print or post-event print.
le tirage vintage
Yes,
et
we
la
mentioned
notion
vintage prints.
surtout d'être le plus proche en fait de
And
ce que le
of
photographe
course,
avait
this
dit
idea
au
of
moment où il
trying
prend
to
la
be
photo.
as
C'est vraiment ça,
close
c'est
as
pas plus
the
compliqué que ça.
photographer's
C'est
intent
vraiment
as we
l'effet divin.
can.
C'est comme, je sais pas, de Chirico avec ses peintures. Il
Talking
a fait des
about
peintures dans les années 20 et
Chirico
puis des œuvres
painting
dans les
in
années
the
50.
20s or
Bah,
painting
on
again
n'a pas,
in the
on veut,
50s.
on veut ce qu'il avait fait à cette époque-là avec cette énergie-là.
We
Donc,
know we want
tirage
to have access
original,
to
c'est le
these
tirage.
works.
C'est le tirage
He
donc,
wanted
qui a été
to,
fait à
with
l'époque
what he wanted to reveal. So we know
de la
these
photographie.
prints
Ensuite, il y a la notion de tirage
revealed
moderne
right after
en
the
français ou
shoot. And then
lifetime
I
print
know
un peu
in
en anglais.
France we talk
J'aime bien
about
le nom en anglais
lifetime
parce qu'on
prints.
comprend que c'est de la vie de l'artiste, c'est-à-dire que voilà, comme on
Lifetime
l'avait dit,
prints very
un photographe
much
peut tirer ses
reveals
photographies 30 ans plus tard, 40 ans plus tard pour
what the
une
photographers
exposition, une
wanted to reveal.
publication,
We know that it could be reprinted
pour une
during
œuvre.
for a
Et donc,
specific
c'est le
exhibition, for a
tirage moderne
specific
dans ce
gallery.
sens.
So these
Après, on
modern
fait même la distinction pour
prints,
Cartier-Bresson des tirages années
we
40 ou
know
années
for
50 ou années
Cartier-Bresson,
60.
we know this is a
Ça,
30s print,
ça paraît un peu
40s print or
abstrait
50s
comme ça, mais
print,
en fait,
which may sound
tout est de
abstract
comparer. Quand vous avez ces tirages devant vous,
today,
si
but
vous
the
voyez un
idea is
tirage des
to
années 40, un tirage des années
compare
50,
for
60,
you.
des
You should
80,
know as a
c'est un peu ça
viewer
tout
whether
tout le
this is
premier effet, c'est de
this print
comparer.
from the
Et quand
30s,
vous
from
voyez
the
les tirages
40s, from the 50s. It
il
is
y a
our
aucun,
work as
c'est
experts,
beaucoup plus beau quand vous voyez
specialists.
celui des
Of
années
course, you will
50
know
que vous
it
voyez
will look
celui
much
des
more
années
beautiful if you
90
see the
dont
print from
parle
the
Henri,
50s
qui est
compared
à la
to
juste d'une pâle photocopie, si
the
je puis dire, par rapport
70s print, which
à
looks
la
like a
force et
photocopy.
la
It just
granularité
looks like a
de
copy
ce tirage des années
compared
50.
to
Donc
that
tout va dans
grain
la comparaison. Donc
specificity of the print from the
si on n'a
50s.
pas de comparaison, on ne peut
But
pas
really,
voir.
the
C'est comme un
essence
vin
is
ou c'est
in
comme,
the
je ne sais pas,
comparison.
d'autres
If we
domaines.
don't have
Il faut
anything to compare with,
voilà, un peu plus de
we
profondeur de connaissance sur un
have
domaine.
to have the knowledge
Ensuite,
to understand the
les tirages
depth
postérieurs,
of
c'est les
differences.
tirages qui
So,
ont été
in
faits
terms of
après la
what
mort
we call
du photographe. Donc,
posterior prints, so
après,
post
voilà,
death of the
il y a
photographer.
plus ou moins de notions d'importance là-dedans selon qui les
So,
fait. Parce que,
how
par exemple,
significant is it? It depends who
pour
is
certains photographes ou quand il est
printing,
mort,
because
c'est son tireur, donc c'est la
certain
personne qui
photographers
tirait
we
ses
know
photographies, qui continue de
they
faire des
were
tirages
using
avec
the
des
same
éditions limitées
printer,
avec
a
des
certain
extraits.
printer where they
On
were
peut se
alive,
dire,
and the
ok,
same
vous êtes
printer
le plus
continues
proche
printing after their
de la
death. Then
qualité
we
que
can
voulait le
think that we
photographe.
are
Et on
as
se dit que
close
c'est
to
son
the
tireur qui le fait.
quality the
Mais
photographer
des fois,
wanted to
c'est aussi
achieve because the
d'autres tirages
printer
qui ont
is
été
the
faits beaucoup
same.
plus
But
tard.
we can think there
Certains
are
tirages
photographies
posthumes
being
valent
printed
cher parce
also
qu'ils sont
later on.
quand
So
même assez proches de ce que
certain
voulait le photographe, et d'autres sont vraiment beaucoup
prints,
plus bas. Donc l'exemple, par
posthumous
exemple,
prints
Man
are
Ray
more expensive,
François
others
vient de
are
montrer,
cheaper. The
il
Man
peut
Ray
être à 100 000 euros pour l'original et pour un
picture, we
posthume, il
could
peut être
think
un
it is
peu plus cher parce que en
100,000
fait, il faut
euros for
considérer que
a
à part
lifetime
l'image, ça n'a
print,
pas vraiment
whereas it would be
grand lien
1,000 euros in a
avec
posthumous
l'objet photographique de l'époque.
print because it's not so
Alors,
much related with the
pour
photographies back in.
rebondir sur ce que dit Jonas,
To
ici
come
vous
back
avez
on
une
what
photo
Jonas
extrêmement
says,
célèbre de
you have a
Eugène
famous
Atelier.
photograph from Eugène
Le
Atelier,
mannequin dans la
the
vitrine. Je crois qu'il en
models
existe un
in
exemplaire dans le monde, un ou
I
deux
think there
peut-être.
is only
Il se
one
trouve Adjé
copy
mort
in
en
the world.
1927
Ajay died
et
in
Berenice Abbott, à sa
1927,
mort,
and
a
Bernie
racheté ces
Sabat,
négatifs.
when he
Elle
died,
a demandé, elle a
bought
demandé
the
Julien
negative.
Lévy, qui était sa galerie,
Julian
et donc elle
Levy,
a ramené
it was
des
her
tirages, mais elle a
gallery, so
ramené
she
aussi
brought
rapporté pardon, des
prints,
négatifs.
but
Eh
she
bien,
also brought
voilà. Alors, vous
negatives.
voyez,
So here I force a little bit, but here Eugène Adjé from so it's a lifetime print, and here is a posterior one from the negative of Eugène Adjé, which is not of the same nature. That was printed in the 30s, as Jonas says. I would, you said, okay, well, it might cost 100,000 for the lifetime prints and 5,000 for the ones post-mortem. I wanted to tell you that it's not because it's old that it's a good print. Of course, some can't be seen anymore. You can't see anything on the photograph. Well, except if you want. From a marketing point of view, it has no worth. And at the back, you see Photo Adjé, and you have the name of Julien Lévy, the gallery. Everything is indicated there. It's not the same amount, but as it is from the 30s, it also has some value. Here again, I would like to talk about colleagues who are on the fair. Auguste Sander. These, I don't know if it's the son or the grandson of Auguste Sander. Julian Sander exhibits a series of photographs at the entrance. I recommend you to go and see them. So from the negatives of his grandfather, he made some prints. So it's posterior prints. Well, I didn't put the back, it's a pity. Well, everything is indicated at the back. So the original, I haven't had it, but I think it was sold for 80,000 euros. That's what you would imagine? Yes. And I sold one. I had a posterior one that I sold 8,000 euros in Sotheby. So it's related to Jürgen Nevsger, who works with chambers. Just to tell you that former tools can be used by contemporary photographers. I would like to come back to a former photograph. I forgot something important. Here you have a very well-known photograph by Man Ray, Le Violon d'Ingres. Another anecdote here. This violon d'Ingres was made, I think, in 1927, and in the 60s, the merchant of Man Ray tells him, "You made a very nice photograph of Kiki. Let's make a new print." Man Ray was always happy to earn some money. Sometimes it's the responsibility of galleries to reprint some former photographs. So Man Ray says, "Okay, good idea." And he couldn't find his negative. So nothing there. He said, "Okay, I know. Who has the original print?" "It's André Breton." Okay, they went to André Breton. They took the photograph, and what they did, they photographed the photograph. So it's called a countertype. It's the copy of an image when you have lost the negative. So this photo is unique. You are the expert. You can see it in Beaubourg because they don't. For the surrealism exhibition, they took it out, which is not often. And it's currently exhibited, so it's quite a unique opportunity to see this print. On the market, we have seen many modern prints. Or here you have a shot that is worth 1 million euros. That from the 60s was sold 12 million. So the original, yeah, this close-up is has become the Mona Lisa of photography. So this. The other day I was walking in the street and I saw a girl who had these two things tattooed on her back. It now entered popular pop culture. It has become totally iconic. The original print, which is in Pompidou, it's not a game for experts. There's a real added value to see it because it's much nicer than what was printed afterwards. When you compare different prints, if you do not compare, you cannot understand the difference. So the edition was made with Arthur Rochouat in 10 copies, I guess. So on the photograph, Man Ray had signed his original copy, and he signed again. So you have a signature on the image and another one on the copy, on the print, the new print. So I would like to come back. So sensitive surfaces. I will now mention the film we saw earlier on. So the silver photograph. So the manufacturing of sensitive surface is increasingly disappearing. Yeah, it is true that the video is interesting because it was absolutely dramatic. Kodak was the biggest photography company. They were making very small and cheap cameras, but they had many labs, catalogs of thousands of products that they sell to reveal, fix the photographs, and this stopped in 2012 in Rochester. It was dramatic because the whole city was working for Kodak, 3,000 or 4,000 people, I guess. It was an absolute drama. The end of Kodak, well, the city was, the whole city was unemployed. And I read an article that Kodak did not want to go to digital. They were stuck to silver, so that led to this catastrophe. Here is Robert Burles. It's a Canadian photographer who photographed all the destroyed Kodak manufacturers. It looks like a funeral. And to tell you that contemporary photographers, Bogdan Konopka, for instance, he printed on paper and that does not exist anymore. And you see this photograph is a vintage. Why would it be a vintage? Because it's a sort of paper that does not exist anymore. I can't find it anymore. And he was very sensitive to the fact that his photographs didn't have the same look as before. Bogdan is in the Le Douche Gallery, Marc Revedel in the Luisotti Gallery, and Marc, I had some prints in my gallery, and Marc asked me on a regular basis, can you send me prints, because I do not have such paper. And some photographers kept stocks of papers in refrigerators. So that's a process that completely disappeared. Cibachrome. You can't find such prints anymore. I think Roland Dufaux did it, but he completely stopped. I began with photography in the 70s. I'm Swiss at the end of the 70s. And I remember very well, photography was in black and white. And I remember that sometimes photographers came to my gallery and said, I'm very sad because the paper that I like to work with does not exist anymore. I have to go to Toronto to buy it. A few years later, the same photographer, now I have to go to New York because I can't find them in Toronto. So it's a really decreasing line. As Françoise said, people said, I bought as much stock as possible, and 2 years afterwards, it's over. You can't find this paper anymore. Why this paper hunt? Well, it's quality that interests them. Cibachrome, and you can see some of them in here in the fair. There's some magic in these Cibachromes. These prints are just marvelous. Former prints are very rich in silver salts, which is very interesting for the violon d'Ingres, because the print is absolutely beautiful. When papers are not that good, it's sort of flat. Some digital prints are good too, but it provides you a certain depth. I think that in the 50s and 60s, they progressively took some silver out of the paper. Yes, maybe there was also a big change in the paper industry in the 50s. That's how we can determine the date of a photography. With ultraviolet light, you can determine whether the photograph is from before or after the 50s, because products changed at that period. Something interesting too, a photograph, you always have to look at its back. And there are specialists. There are 2 books that were published. Well, 6 of them were published, because according to the stamps, you can determine the date of the photograph. Here is Brassailles. It is true that it helps beyond the fact that you can see they are different. It helps you determine the date. Okay, that's the photograph he did in Paris at that period. for that exhibition. It provides you with additional information. You told me Avedon put very detailed information at the back of his photographs. Yes, at least for the market, there's this notion to, well, you want to know what you buy. The more information you find, the better. It's a tribal science, so to speak. Sometimes you can't have a proof, but if Avedon, at the back of all his prints, there is a signing, a stamp with a silver print, toned, blah, 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 and then the edition, not exceeding 50 prints or something. And also, which techniques, which edition, a copyright stamp, everything is at the back of the photograph. So photographers such as Avedon or Kate Print have had a commercial success because of that, because you know what you buy. In this market, multiple market, you never know how many prints there are. How many prints of Cartier-Bresson? Nobody knows. When they began to put numbers on their prints, in Paris Photo, there's also an edition, but for Brassailles, you can't find any edition. It's only with the stamp that you may know if it's a rare or not print. Sometimes you have to trust the merchant the gallerist, who will tell you, who will be able to determine the date of the photograph. Well, Sugimoto indicates the number, the edition, and a dry stamp with a reference number and a signature. Sugimoto does it for every print, so you can't have photographs with or without. Okay, it makes it more readable for a collector. That's why Man Ray market is quite difficult, because he did a little bit of everything. It's also a detective, an investigation work. This morning in my hotel, I saw a very nice framed photograph. I took the photograph, and I think it's a vintage print. So I took it out of the frame, I turned it, and at the back there was a stamp saying Vienna, another one Berlin, and a small paper with a sort of explanation, a small text. It is dated, but the year is lost. It shows January 11th, but no year. But it's clearly a vintage print. That's why I tell you it's a detective work. I have to ask a Vienna specialist to tell me about the agency that circulated the photograph, and maybe we can find a photographer. So I come to Paris to discover a vintage photograph, and in my hotel, I'm not going to say which hotel. It's because you have an eye. Some of you, I see a collector here, someone who collects African statues. How do you... I see Charlotte Barthélemy, who's an expert for Le Moine. I had seen the catalogue, and I saw the photographs, and I said to Charlotte, it's incredible the difference when you see them for real. Today you find reproductions, you see them on a screen, on the internet, but to see them for real, it's totally different. And it is important to watch them. So we wanted to end with
parce qu'il est quand même, il est presque 52, on a 8 minutes. Est-ce qu'on passe juste à la conservation ou
shall we talk about conservation?
Dire quelque chose?
Non, peut-être
No.
le jeu détective dans
I would like to come back on the idea of being a detective.
Par exemple, pour Man Ray, pour donner une idée
for Man Ray, and to tell you a little bit about expertise. When you have a photograph of Man Ray, we have a look at the dimensions. Through the dimensions, we know if he did it in Europe or in the States, because formats are not the same. According to the size, we may know if it was for publication or not. Is it a beautiful paper? Was it for an exhibition? Or is it a more simple paper for the press? Then we have a look at the signature. Is it an original signature or a late one? Sometimes he signed with a wrong date, or as the negatives are in Pompidou, we know the exact dates and not the dates indicated by Man Ray at the back of the photograph. So it's a detective game, so to speak. Very quickly, I would like to tell you about conservation. It's also something important. We saw a bad adjet. Of course, you do not buy a photograph. Alain Pavillot often says photography is not a stamp, post stamp, as the chair by Charlotte Perriand. So these photographs are not small, so prints have lived. Some contemporary photographers claim that if their prints age, well, they say, well, it will age, that's it. We're all submitted to the passing of time. And when I tell someone, I will love you always, well, it's for 70 years maximum. So it's also a condition when you buy a photograph. It has to be in a good shape. You have to look at them in a with a specific light. There are acceptable accidents or not acceptable. When you go to the metro and you buy a can, a Coca-Cola can, or a pack of sweets at the end of an exhibition, you can also buy prints at the end of an exhibition. You choose the photograph, you choose the frame, the dimension, and you put your credit card, you pay, and you get a print. And sometimes people think it's expensive. You can also take a photograph from a magazine and frame it. Here is what you can find on the internet. You can find different versions. That's a print from Gustave Le Gray, and you have many possibilities. So I always come back to this sentence: you have to know what you have bought. But the pleasure is what counts. Sometimes something is very expensive and you may want to buy something cheaper, but you have to know what you buy. You can also have it as a cushion, which shows that photography is an object that is disseminated and which is part and parcel of our daily lives. And it has become something natural. André Rouillet often says now the camera has become an app as any other in our mobile. I think we have some 10 minutes. If you have some questions, the mic can circulate. No question? Were you interested? Thank you. As far as I'm concerned, you're very welcome in the gallery. I have no money, I can't buy. It's not a problem. I can't be there 24/7, but if you're interested, you're very much welcome. You call me and we can discuss and look at things together. It's always a pleasure to share what you like. I have a question. I'm a curator. I very often work with living photographers and dead photographers. I prefer dead ones because they are less problematic. I would like to give you a quote. A photographer told me that there are extraordinary on the last negatives, 35 photographs or 36. He never had the time to print them because he died suddenly. So there was something in his camera that he thought was very interesting. So with his widow, we printed them. He had never seen them, and we clearly indicated how they were made. So they have a value. And if I quote another instance, I made a retrospective of Blumenfeld, and I found in his studio, in a drawer, an extraordinary photograph. Blumenfeld, naked, giving birth to a beautiful woman. I invented the beautiful woman, he said something. The family did not want to print it. I found the negative, sorry. So I said, it's so extraordinary and psychologically extraordinary. It was proof that he had invented of modern beauty. They authorized the printing for the book. As many of you, we have curators in the room. In these situations, strange situations, the thing I always respect is to indicate what it means. That's the main thing. You have to know what you're looking at. then we provided you with the general rules. There are many exceptions because each life is different. At one point, he entered or she entered the market, or never did, or they have different lives most of the time. So the market has to adapt to the existing prints. The market will not dictate what happens. It's the other way around. The market adapts. The photographer decides if they want to make 3 or 5 copies. And these were post-mortem photographs. Yeah, you have to negotiate with the heirs from a documentary point of view. It's interesting and it's also beautiful. About the market, I was told, I was with Alice Joubert, a former student from ESA, who now heads the Galerie Irène. She gave me an example of a widow who said, okay, now that he's dead, we will not print anything anymore. In what we said, it's always our interpretation, but what is interesting is to understand and to ask the questions. There are never no question is stupid. Thank you so much.
Le petit cahier de tirage là, c'est